Across the United States and the world, one of the rarest and most disturbing forms of homicide is when a parent kills a child. Criminologists refer to it as filicide. It used to only occasionally appear in the headlines, but that has changed. Something shifted during COVID lockdowns, and this crime began to escalate. We see this in headlines weekly now. Most people only read about these horrific cases in the headlines, but behind those headlines are investigators that have discovered patterns that lead to filicide. Patterns like escalating abuse or untreated mental illness, financial stress, and isolation. All of these things can lead to filicide. During COVID-19, those pressures intensified for most families, and the first line of defense when it comes to child abuse was taken out of the equation. Schools were closed. Economic stress surged. And in most homes, the safety nets that should have detected the abuse before it went too far, were no longer in place. Just this week in Enterprise, Alabama, Adrienne Reed was charged with the murder of her 2-year-old daughter, Genesis Reed. Genesis had been missing since Christmas. She wasn't reported missing until February the 16th. We're going to talk about all this tonight and several other cases of filicide on the porch with Munchies and Murder. We're going to talk about the patterns of abuse that lead to these cases and what could be done to stop it. Filicide is a horrific crime that affects everyone around it. Now, I grew up reading about people like Diane Downs or Deborah Green and Susan Moore, and I thought to myself, well, that's awful, but it doesn't happen very often. Now, at this point in time, in 2026, we read about these cases on a weekly basis. We've seen a fair amount of cases over the last few years involving what we refer to as a Cinderella child. One child out of the family that has been picked. They suffer all of the abuse, and several of these children have died. We've heard about cases over custody disputes, where mothers or fathers decided that they didn't want the other parent to have access to the child, so they killed the children. We've heard about cases of postpartum depression, women who were in the throes of mental illness who took the lives of their children. Being in the midst of a mental illness doesn't excuse the murder, but it does explain it. Now, the first category of filicide that we're going to talk about is called altruistic. It's when the parent decides the child is better off dead. A good example of this would be Matthew Coleman out of California. Back in 2021, Matthew decided that his children had serpent DNA in them. So he took both of his daughters to Mexico. He murdered both of them and returned home. Matthew's trial is still ongoing. The next category of filicide we're going to talk about is called psychotic filicide, and it is exactly what it sounds like. The parent kills a child during a psychotic break or during hallucinations. A good example of this would be Andrea Yates, the woman who drowned her 5 children in the bathtub in 2001. Andrea Yates was later found to be suffering from postpartum depression, and she was in the throes of a psychotic break when she killed her children. The next category we're going to talk about in filicide is called the unwanted child filicide, and it, again, is exactly how it sounds. The parent decides that they no longer want the child for whatever reason. A good example of this case would be Susan Smith in 1994. Now, Susan had 2 sons. She strapped them both into the back of the car, gave them ice cream, and then pushed the car into a lake. She left her 2 sons to drown. Susan had met another man, and she decided she no longer wanted to be a mother. Susan is currently sitting in prison. The fourth and final category of filicide that we're going to talk about is spouse revenge filicide. And again, it sounds exactly like what it is. It's when a parent kills a child to keep the other parent from gaining access to them. Now, a really good example of this is a very recent case. It just happened in January of 2026 in Wyoming. Madeline Daly, 35 years old. Now, Madeline had just lost a custody dispute. So Madeline took her son from Wyoming and fled to New Mexico, where law enforcement officials found them in an RV. Madeline had taken the life of her son. She has not yet stood trial. So let's get into some specific cases of filicide. Let's start in Alabama. Now, I told y'all earlier that Adrienne Reed was arrested this week for the murder of her 2-year-old daughter, Genesis Reed. Again, Adrienne reported Genesis missing on February the 16th, but people in the area said that Genesis had not been seen since Christmas, December the 25th. Now, just before Adrienne reported Genesis missing, she was confronted at a store on Valentine's Day. The person wanted to know where Genesis was. Adrienne did not have a reply. Now that the investigation has gotten in there pretty good, it turns out that Adrienne murdered Genesis. She then placed her body inside of a duffel bag and put it in the dumpster at the apartment complex. Law enforcement officials are currently combing through the landfills, searching for Genesis's remains. Heather Keaton, Cherokee County, Alabama, 2020. Heather killed her 7-year-old daughter, Olivia. When law enforcement officials arrived at the home, they went inside and found Olivia suffering from several stab wounds. Court documents in this case indicate that Heather was suffering severe mental illness. She has been charged with capital murder, but this case is kind of stalled out. There's a lot of competency hearings going on and things like that. The next case we have is Stephen Collins out of Fayette, Alabama, and this is from 2024, when it was discovered that his 1-year-old son, Caleb Collins, was missing. Now, they found that Caleb was missing after a fatal wreck that killed Stephen and killed another child that was in the home. When investigators went inside the home, they discovered there had been severe abuse. These children had suffered greatly. Now, law enforcement officials have not discovered Caleb's remains yet, but they do believe that he is deceased. There have been a couple of other people arrested in this case, but none of them have gone to trial yet. Christina Hurt, Limestone County, Alabama, 2017. She murdered her daughter, and she admitted in court documents that she had slammed her child against the wall and the floor. Christina Hart is currently sitting in prison. Timothy Jones Jr. This started in South Carolina and ended in Alabama. Timothy was upset over a custody dispute, so he took his 5 children, ages 1 to 8, and fled with them. He murdered them somewhere between South Carolina and Alabama, where he dumped their bodies. Timothy was given the death penalty. One really disturbing thing that I came across while researching this was that more cases of filicide occur in the South than any other region in the United States. Julie Schnecker, 2011, Tampa, Florida. Julie killed her 2 teenagers, ages 13 and 16, in their home while her husband was deployed. It's been mentioned multiple times that Julie was suffering from severe mental illness, but Julie was convicted of capital murder and is serving a life sentence. Yasser Saeed, 2008, Texas. This is a horrific case. A mother that tried to hide her children from an abusive father, and he got his hands on them anyway. His 2 teenage daughters, age 18 and 17. He shot both of them multiple times and then fled. Yasser stayed on the run for over a decade before the FBI finally caught up to him. Yasser is currently serving a life sentence. Casey Anthony, 2008, Florida. Yes, I'm aware that Casey Anthony was found not guilty of murdering her daughter, but guilty of lying to investigators. Kaylee's body was missing for months before her remains were finally discovered. And in my opinion, Casey Anthony murdered Kaylee, and law enforcement officials in Florida botched that investigation. 2018, California. The Hart family. 6 children murdered. Diane Stout, 2012, Missouri. 1 child murdered. 2013, Tennessee. Lindsay Lowe. 2 infants murdered. They were twins. 2012, New York. Manuel Mangano. 1 child murdered. Chris Watts, 2013. Colorado, 2 children murdered. Deanna Laney, 2010, Texas, 2 children murdered. I could go on for hours with specific cases, but we're going to go ahead and stop there. All of those cases, over decades, numbers that are continuing to escalate, child after child, whose lives were taken by their parent, the one person that they should have been able to trust, the person that should have protected them, kept them safe, cut their life short far, far too early. Now, these cases were happening before COVID, but something happened during those lockdowns. There was a spark lit that allowed these cases to burn out of control. And we're out of COVID now. These cases should be coming down in numbers, but they're not. They're continuing to rise across the United States, especially in the South. Now, there could be a lot of contributing factors to it being more predominant in the South. And I'm just going to say right here, I'm tired of leading the pack in stuff that we don't need to be leading the pack in. I'm just saying, it would be really nice for the South, Alabama specifically, to lead the pack in something for once, like maybe protecting children. That would be a good one because we're falling dead last. Yeah, when it comes to protecting our kids in schools, in their homes, DHR, all we're failing miserably in the state of Alabama. And the children are our future. All the damage that's being done to these children now, they're our future. So now we've come to that part of the discussion where everybody's wondering, what can we do? This is awful. What can we do? The biggest thing you can do is pay attention to those around you, especially the children. If a child goes missing and hasn't been seen in a little while, people should be asking questions. If a child has bruises on them all the time, people should be asking questions. Filicide is one of the most disturbing acts of violence. It violates the most basic human decencies. The one thing a parent is supposed to do is protect their child. The people that children should be able to depend on to protect them are their parents. And every day we are seeing more and more of these cases where parents are killing their children. And while each one of these cases are different, patterns emerge again and again and again. Escalating abuse, mental illness that has gone untreated, custody disputes, and currently in the United States, the leading situation in filicide is custody disputes. That is currently leading the pack. People are murdering their children the most during custody disputes. Isolation and financial stress are other patterns that indicate things are starting to spin out of control. So what do we need to do? Now, understanding these patterns is not about sensationalizing tragedy. That's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to give everyday people an insight into the patterns that lead to filicide so that you recognize these patterns so that these children can be helped before it's too late. If you take anything away from this podcast, I want you to know that preventing filicide takes vigilance, a support system, and access to care. Those three things can prevent filicide. In filicide cases, the question on investigators' minds is not how this could happen, but how many of these could be stopped. I want to thank y'all for hanging out with me tonight on the porch with Munchies and Murder while we discussed a very serious issue that is continuing to escalate in the United States. This was a heavy subject to tackle this week, and some of y'all may have a difficult time listening to that podcast, and I understand. But I also want you to know that knowing these patterns, understanding how this happens, and knowing what to do if you believe that something like this is going on is the only way that we can prevent this. Now, I hope y'all have a good week. Join me right back here next week on the porch with Munchies and Murder, where we dive deep again on crime, corruption, and that good old boy system. Y'all have a good week now.